Okay, and we're going live today. This is Jim Casey doing a walkabout for Talk TV. How are you? Hey, this is a walkabout I did last Saturday, but there was some kind of cyber attack and the glitches messed it up. So I've been doing some fine tuning again. This is going to be about Andrew Jackson's march into Huntsville, because where we left off a few weeks ago was really not much of the whole story. But in conjunction with Historic Preservation Week in Huntsville, I'm also going to talk about some of my ancestors, which is why I'm starting off here in Big Spring Park. This is literally the center of where Huntsville began in 1805, 1809. And one thing I want to point out about this spring is there was up to 60 million gallons of water a day flowing out of this spring. Sometimes it was as little as 10 million gallons, but of course that's an enormous amount of water. And that's important because we're going to talk a little bit about a canal that was once built here, the Indian Creek Canal, in just a minute. Nowadays, the city of Huntsville pumps the water out for drinking water. And so that's why you really don't see anywhere near that much. And along here is a canal, but not quite as big, probably not quite as wide as the original Indian Creek Canal that they built back between 1820 and 1830. This section is probably, I've never been aware of it before, but this is probably about the same size as the locks were, which is one of the things that probably doomed the canal, because they really weren't quite big enough. They were only 10 feet by 70 feet. And they probably didn't have any goldfish in them. Look at that, that's a really big, nice goldfish to see today. And so our walkabout is to go from here to Pinhook Creek. And the reason I mention the canal is because there is a parallel between the canal and Pinhook Creek from here to Bird Springs Road, or Bird Springs rather. And that would not have been the case probably if you go back to before 1820. Because of course Andrew Jackson marched into Huntsville and camped out in 1830. So while I finish this story, I'm going to offer my conjecture and innuendo. And this is what we're going to call the Hollywood version, because after looking at more than one source with more than one citation, there seem to be a number of conflicts, different facts that don't exactly meet, and some things that I think are just a little bit ridiculous. So I'm giving you my version today of what happened on that day. And what I have said is that if you happen to be a kid who's taken a test and your teacher asks you to give her the answers, you better look at your notes and tell her what she wants to hear. Because I'm going to tell it my way today. This is actually Church Street, and it may or may not have been here. Actually, this was a street called Henry Street, or adjacent to a street called Henry Street. And anyway, so probably what happened when Andrew Jackson came into town from Fayetteville, they say it was a forced march that happened in only 5 hours. And there are a lot of reasons why that just doesn't exactly make sense. Some stories say that there were people who were actually leaving as early as 9 o'clock in the morning. And in my way of thinking, that's probably more accurate. Once Jackson sent out the call to muster the troops, he got a disappointing response from the people who had already been in service, because he only got like 1,000 or 1,500 that immediately responded, they say, in Fayetteville. I'm showing this Orion because the Orion Amphitheater, which this is apparently commemorating, opened this weekend and on Saturday. So we get to see a little more history in the making right there. That's out on the west side of Huntsville. But anyway, so the way I see it is, more likely what happened is men started filing into Fayetteville in the morning. They would register, visit the quartermaster. I don't know if they had any supplies to hand out to them or not, whatever consignments they would get. And most likely, they told them to, he'd ask them, what do you want us to do? And at this point, they're just really not all that organized. And my guess is they just told them to get on the road and go to Beatty Spring. And Beatty Spring is what is now called Bronze Spring in Huntsville. And that's actually where they are officially camped. But I think there's more to it than that. So anyway, they'd start hitting road at 9 o'clock in the morning. Maybe someone came along with a horse. If he did, that would probably have to be conscripted until dismissed. And thereafter, there would be a steady stream of men that were on the road. Might have been a few showed up with wagons. Wagons would probably have picked up a few supplies. Both Fayetteville and Huntsville, Beatty Spring and Huntsville, were supply points for the War of 1812, which is where my ancestor actually comes in. I did actually establish the fact that there is a person named Casey who was one of the original settlers in Madison County. He apparently went to the War of 1812, but I think that was prior to this mustering for the Creek War, even though the Creek War is sometimes explained as being a part of the War of 1812. There had been a lull, and the records seem to indicate that he was part of the original mustering for the War of 1812. But what I do know is that he was registered to vote, and he owned land, or there was a father-son combination there. And even though I'm still looking at it, and I feel certain there's a connection, looks like he might be a second great-granduncle, but that's yet to be determined. But anyway, that's one of those things it's kind of nice to figure out. What I also know, though, is that the chances of being a direct descendant, since I've already established that line, are slim to none. But we was here. So anyway, when they was up in Nashville and they're doing the consignments, the wagons probably would have taken a little bit longer, and this is about the time that Andrew Jackson got a message from Davy Crockett. And this whole idea that the whole thing happened in a 5-hour march is what I have come to a conclusion of as having been something of a Crockett, because you'd had to have, if you had in the maybe probably 3,000 people that were actually marching from Fayetteville, and if they were in close ranks, all trying to make the trip at once, they had to do it, be going at what would be a half trot on a horse. And when I say half trot, I'm saying that they would trot half the time and they would canter at a normal pace half the time. So the idea that you had these closed ranks of 3,000 men in a two-mile long caravan doing a half trot is what I think is pretty much absurd. So that's why I'm saying that my Hollywood version is that most likely you had people along the trail from 9 o'clock in the morning. The last one's probably left out by 3 o'clock, and I can imagine that the wagons were probably a little bit later in the day, if there were wagons at all, because while there would have been wagons eventually when they got to Beatty Spring, it's unclear whether or not they had wagons in the trail from Fayetteville. Well, anyway, then when you figure you've got a caravan that's spread out over 6 hours and over 30 miles, the fact is, where that sign was, which is the historic marker originally placed, is about a couple miles in that direction. And that historic marker is pretty close to where they actually entered. Some people look at Andrew Jackson Way, but Andrew Jackson Way is commemorative probably because they would have come straight down the Meridian, which is literally Meridian Street, to Green Street. At that point, some of them may have even exited and went to the west. There's even evidence that Cleveland Avenue might have provided a route, and then Holmes Avenue, and even Clinton Avenue. And so it's not exactly clear to me what happened. What I think happened, though, is that there were local roads that are not on the maps, where First Street is and where Seminole Drive is. I think they hugged Pinhook Creek, and I think as soon as they got to Pinhook Creek, the head of the caravan, they just probably filed in and camped out right away, right along Pinhook Creek all the way back. All right, I don't believe we're going to go all the way to Tennessee today, but we're going to keep on going until we get to Pinhook Creek. Might as well take a nice look at the fish and the ducks while we're here. All right, well, I got my ducks in a row, that's for sure. Let's see. Ooh, boy, there's a carp. Look at that one. That one's about 3 feet long. And we get a really nice shot of the goldfish here because we got the lighting in this tunnel here. So, the only thing I would probably figure is they probably would have been admonished not to go into downtown and not to go to the big spring because they would have been a nuisance and there was too many of them. So then the rest of the story is that there were people who were joining the ranks along the way. Some of them probably said, you know, we're not going 20 miles to Fayetteville just to turn around and come back 30 miles to Huntsville. And then there was a bunch of them that joined in Huntsville, so that by the time, oh look, they turned the fountain on for us. By the time they get to the other side of Ditto's Landing, there's at least 4,000 people. 600 of those are John Coffey's men, which are mounted riflemen. And now, since I'm not Army, and I don't know if there is a fundamental difference between riflemen and cavalry, or if that's a precursor or a different designator, but anyway. And so I think when Davy Crockett sent his letter claiming the Indians were going to attack Huntsville, and then saying that the remainder were on their way, that was probably a cheeky way of telling the General Jackson to light a fire and get moving because John Coffey's waiting for them. They're already down at Hobbs Island, and I think they had a rapport and language that those men understood between the three of them. There never was any realistic threat to Huntsville. That's been well established, and most likely General Jackson had more than one reference that he was considering at that point. And so this canal, again between 1820 and 1830, was used to transport cotton. I'm going down to the end here, so we're going to talk about that first. says they had 250-pound bales piled 80 to 100 on flatboats. And if you don't know the story of how that worked, when the flatboats left out, they would go, in this case, they would go from Huntsville down to about Triana and hit the Tennessee River. And from the Tennessee River, they would float all the way down to New Orleans. And there were two locks apparently on the spring branch, which is what this represents, or what this actually is. So there again, if you when the boats got to New Orleans, they were dismantled for lumber, if you can imagine. But as I say, the locks along the Indian Creek Canal were only 10 feet by 70 feet, and that's a bit narrow. And I suppose that when the keel boats came in, that they were no longer able to go into 3 feet of water. The canal would have had about 3 feet of water, and it would have been designed for a draft of 10 inches. This is where the Marriott is in Huntsville, and that is the Von Braun Center. And down they would go to Triana, taking this exact route. Now, I've looked at the maps, and one thing I can say is that Pinhook Creek at Holmes Avenue, which is about a mile north of here, is exactly where it was in 1860, which means it's most likely exactly where it was prior to 1860. And that also means that Pinhook Creek, which we are approaching, is, I could tell by those maps that it took a straight shot and then took a slight turn as it intersected with Brogland Branch, not Brogland Branch, when Pinhook Creek met with this branch, Spring Branch. And so, as we approach Pinhook Creek right here, we know it's in just about the exact same spot. The only question is that the Spring Branch, which is this, might have been a little further north, but most likely it really looks like it probably would have hit almost in exactly this spot. And so anyway, that is Pinhook Creek, and you see here it's meeting with the Spring Branch. The Spring Branch was diverted to be the canal, 1820 to 1860, and because Pinhook Creek would have been drain water, would have had wild, uncontrollable fluctuations and not enough water. So anyway, it was a parallel during that period of time. Before that period of time, most likely, this is where the two met. That being the case, my Hollywood version is that in about 2 miles south-southwest of here is Beatty Spring, which is today's Bronze Spring. And if they came all the way up Pinhook Creek, if you have about, at that point there was probably about 3,000 men in the ranks. And that whole caravan, if it spread out along Pinhook Creek, the chances are they would have been camping right up to about this point. And the reason I think they did that is that really it's a 3-ring circus at this point, because they probably don't yet have officer assignments or division assignments. They still have a lot of people that are going to be joining them when they get down here to Huntsville. They're disciplined men. Beatty Spring, and they're independent, but they're also volunteers. Beatty Spring was designed to be a supply line. So even though the Army was renting that out, it probably had not been set up for a Gomer pile and a big 3-acre grid set out, in sharp fashion. Not likely to have been like that at all. And so that's why I come to the conclusion that most likely this is where they probably ended their campground. And then everybody knows the story of Andrew Jackson had been injured over a fight, about a duel. And I always wonder if you get the complete story on that. But apparently it had happened about 30 days prior. And he must have had a broken arm, and it might have been causing him some sensitivity. But most likely it was more a question of humiliation to him as an officer, because he's fixing to head out on his campaign. The Creek Indian War, headed for Horseshoe Bend, basically. But anyhow, so what I think happened is, when he gets the word up in Fayetteville about noon, he's probably, he sends a message back that they're on their way, and later on he writes that the goal was accomplished by 3 o'clock in the afternoon. That's probably about true, but I don't think it means he waited himself until 3 o'clock to leave. I think it more likely means that there were people leaving as late as 3 o'clock, and those people may or may not have gotten here within 5 hours. I think he probably would have headed out by high noon or 1 o'clock, remembering this is in September, well, actually the first weeks of October. And at that time of day, he probably could have taken a half trot. He might have made it himself in 5 hours. But then again, if he, when he's writing his letters out and when he's making his appearances and whatever else he's saying, he doesn't want to appear to be weak, and he doesn't want to appear like that injury is causing him any problems. So at any rate, I say he left at 1 o'clock and he got here about 8 o'clock in the evening. And the story that's verbally told, I haven't found any written documentation on it yet, is that he actually spent the evening with Leroy Pope, who is considered to be the father of Huntsville, who settled in 1809. He's the one that brought all the money and got things rolling in terms of development. But I think that unless Andrew Jackson was in a lot of pain from his injury, which is possible, that he would not have gone straight to Pope Leroy's house, which would have been easier if he came in at Green Street. He would have simply gone straight down Green Street and then up into Poplar Grove. More likely, I think he would have come along and surveyed the troops, and he would have wanted to give them confidence and encouragement to see that their leader is with them, and he would have probably trotted all the way from here down to Beatty Spring, and then of course he would be checking in with whatever officers were already there, whether at that point. And then I would say that probably Pope Leroy might have sent an emissary to escort him back to Poplar Grove, where he may have ended up maybe at 10 o'clock in the evening, where he would have had a nice dinner and been entertained and gotten a good night's sleep in a regular bed. After that, the accounts say that they got up the next morning and they took a leisurely stroll to Ditto Landing. This is after the supposed forced march. And most likely what I think happened is Ditto Landing is probably a bottleneck. I did finally find where it's implied there were 2 flatboats at the ferry there. I say 2. There was more than one. It doesn't really say how many, but it's hard for me to imagine that there would be 2 instead of just 1 in the first place. So I doubt if there was more than 2. And they were probably relatively small flatboats, because in 1814 or 1813, the amount of traffic going back and forth south would not have been enough to justify it, I don't think. So then you have to imagine that these boats are probably relatively small. Relatively small means probably 10 or 15 feet by 60 feet. Later on, they got to be as big as 20 feet by 70 feet, about 30 years later. But then you're talking about putting anywhere from 25 to 50 men, wagons, horses, and you're trying to transport 3,000 to 4,000 men across the river doing it like that. It, it certainly would have taken 30 minutes to get back and forth across per flatboat. And if they had two flatboats, I figured it would take at least a 12 or 15 hour day. And more likely, the reason they were strolling leisurely is that the first one's headed out to get down to Ditto Landing, and then the rest of them came along behind at a slower pace, a leisurely pace, because they simply could not get moved across the river that quickly. They were moving across the river all day and maybe all day the next day. So there wasn't a big hurry. In the meantime, that's probably when all the assignments came down, the rolls were checked, and they did keep records. And they may have even been signing up men and taking inventory as they crossed Ditto Landing, or Ditto's Ferry. But at that point, it's when the three-ring circus would have ended. Because as soon as they got across Ditto's Landing, that was pretty much the point of no return. Then they would have fallen in like regular army and regular regiment as they proceeded to march south. And all of the volunteerism and the camaraderie and the new people, everything would have not been quite so much fun as it might have seemed like starting out. Of course, some of them weren't having fun. Some of them had already been in the War of 1812. But at any rate, this whole loosely coalesced group of men then would have finally met their Waterloo as they headed south. And that is a fact. I also say this too. You can imagine if there were 3,000 people that were marching down Parkway today, everybody in Huntsville would line up along the roadway to see them. It seems to me that there were bound to have been spectators, and they would have been lined up along Meridian Street maybe. Some of them might have lined up down whatever road it was, Pulaski Road or First Street or Seminole or Lehman Ferry, wherever they ended up. But it would have been quite a spectacle to watch, to see all these fellas coming in. Well, I'm Jim Casey, and that's my Hollywood version of Andrew Jackson's camp out in Huntsville. Please do go visit my website, which is tocc.tv, and make a contribution if you'd like. And I'm gonna, there I am. It really is me. Y'all have a good day, and thanks for watching.